Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This is the continuation of Swallow the Stars. This will be part 42, chapter 42, entitled Climbing the Pillar. Finals week kicks off with a heavy rainstorm, which Izuku takes as a bad omen. Of what? He isn't sure, but he and Rain have never really been on the best of terms. Aizawa stares them down in homeroom on Monday morning, and the rain pounds against the window. Static rises in Izuku's mind, the way it always does when it rains. He doesn't think this is really something to do with Amahaki, but instead, some piece of trauma that he hasn't worked out of his system yet, which is kind of stupid, in his opinion, because he was freed in the rain. But he also killed people, on purpose, in the rain. You all have final exams this week, Aizawa says, eyes sweeping the room. Izuku forces himself to pay attention, forces the static in his mind to proceed so that he can actually hear what his dad is saying. We went over the schedule on Friday, but I'm going to repeat it again for those who may have forgotten or weren't paying attention. His gaze lingers on a few select students before continuing. Today will be English and modern hero art history. Tuesday will be math and science. Wednesday you'll test on history and Japanese literature. On Thursday you'll have the theoretical portion of fundamental heroics and then ethics and law. Friday is your fundamental heroics practical. He pauses to look across the room again. I mentioned this briefly last week, but there will be a summer camp for those of you who pass. If you fail, you have to stay behind for remedial lessons. A few groans rise up through the room, but Izuku doesn't turn to see who made them. He has his guesses, at least. Each of your exams is 3 hours long, with a break in the middle. Take your time and do your best. Izuku isn't concerned about the written exams. Retaining knowledge is not something he's ever been concerned about, because all he had to do was read something once and then it just sits in his head, waiting for the next time he needs the information. No, it's the heroics practical that's going to be haunting him for the rest of the week. But regardless of his hesitancy, regardless of the unknown hanging over his head, what will they even be asked to do during the heroics final? It'll have to be combat of some sort. It'll have to be a way to prove that they've grown with their quirks and with the fighting strategies Hisashi has drilled into them since All Might was forced away from their class. But will they be fighting each other, or fighting with each other, or... It doesn't matter. He'll get through the written exams and worry about the practical when it happens. And that's exactly what he does. One by one, day by day, Izuku sits in the classroom with the rest of Class 1A and puts pencil to paper on their first set of exams. He finds the whole process interesting, actually, because it's the first time he's really been tested on the extent of his photographic memory. For a while, he kind of thought the depth of his memory only revolved around heroes. It's not like the tests in middle school were a challenge. None of them covered entire terms worth of material that had been fed to him alongside more readily important things like training to be a hero. But each one of these exams is cumulative, and Izuku spends most of his time fascinated by how his brain works. He reads a question covering a topic from early in the year, and then the question is dragged to the forefront of his mind, as if he's just reading it off of the page in his textbook. It's cool. It also kind of feels like cheating. But he decides not to dwell on that, or bring it up to Aizawa lest his dad agree with him and decide to make the test somehow more difficult for him. Izuku would rather the test be too easy than not pass. Then Friday rolls around, and Izuku remembers why he's been so nervous all week. We're fighting teachers? Kaminari's eyes are wide, and Izuku doesn't blame him for the trepidation and borderline fear in his voice. All of their teachers are lined up in front of them, some smiling, some stoic, all of them ready to face down the first years and put them through their paces. That's correct, Kaminari-kun, Nezu says from his perch on Aizawa's shoulder, one paw tangled in the capture weapon to keep his balance. Given the increasing rise in villain activity as of late, and in search of fairness for students who simply aren't suited for it, we as a staff decided that robots won't cut it this year. It will be much more beneficial to you all to test yourselves against a real thinking opponent, and it'll be much easier for us to grade you. Aizawa pulls a folded piece of paper from his pocket while he looks over them all. Us teachers are going to be wearing wrist weights to handicap us and make the fights more evenly matched, he explains. You're all going to be split up into teams, fighting 2 against 1. Between the pair of you, you'll have one set of handcuffs. Your win conditions are as follows. Secure one end of the cuff around the wrist of your opponent, or escape your designated battle area. Even one of you escaping will grant your team a win. You are not being timed. You lose if you both are put out of commission by your opponent. Understood? Yes, Sensei, the class choruses. Good. I'm going to read off your teams and your opponents. With the piece of paper now unfolded, Aizawa drops his eyes to it and begins to read aloud. Izuku doesn't really pay attention, which he would feel guilty about if not for the fact that he is swimming in nerves. For some reason, he has a bad feeling about how this is going to go for him. Well, not for some reason. Logically, there are only 2 teachers that Izuku could be pitted against, and he doesn't like either option. If Amahaki was a real quirk, Izuku knows that he would be facing down Aizawa because in fights, when it matters, Izuku is fully aware that he defaults back on using that power. He can fight without it, yes, and he can think his way out of most situations, but when he's facing down an enemy, every villain he fought at the USJ, Stain, his opponents at the sports festival, the doctor from the facility, he lets Amahaki out. But Aizawa can't erase Amahaki because the god is not really a quirk, and the last thing he needs is for that information to be recorded and stored into video format, no matter how secure UA's digital files are. Thank God both Aizawa and Nezu are in the know about Amahaki, or else this whole test could have ended in disaster. Well, it still very well could. He's pretty sure, actually, that it will. Shinso and Jiro, you'll be facing off against Present Mike. That draws Izuku's attention, especially when Hitoshi stiffens up beside him. It's an interesting matchup, with several disadvantages for the students, the most obvious being Jiro's sensitive hearing against the loudest voice in the world, but also the fact that Hisashi has been helping Hitoshi spar and work with this quirk for a long time now and knows most of his tricks, but there's also several ways for them to win. Izuku internally wishes Hitoshi luck and squeezes his hand in reassurance. Hitoshi squeezes back. Last team, Aizawa says, and Izuku focuses on his dad. He hadn't heard his name called yet, so this must be his team. Unfortunately, he also hasn't been paying attention to the teachers who had been assigned already. Bakugo and Izuku, you'll be fighting All Might. There it is. The reason Izuku's nerves have been churning in his gut all morning. It doesn't help that there was really no other option. He was going to have to face down either All Might, who has the best chance of withstanding Amahaki, or Nezu, who would be able to provide Izuku with a mental challenge. But of course, with the theme of the exam being partnerships and teamwork, they wouldn't put Izuku in a situation where he would be tempted to fight on his own, running mental gymnastics against the smartest being on the planet, nor with a teammate who would let him. So All Might is the obvious, if the least welcome choice, likewise with Bakugo, because even though they get along and consider each other friends, they're both stubborn and tend to lead into leadership or solo roles. It also registers, somewhere in the back of Izuku's mind, that the last time he and Bakugo fought under All Might's gaze, Izuku lost most of the hearing in his left ear. He's slow to board the bus that will take the class around their exam sites, but when he does, it's with a deep breath and square shoulders. Izuku walks right up to Bakugo's seat and plops down next to him. Bakugo doesn't say anything, but he acknowledges his presence with a side-eyed glance and a grunt of greeting. Maybe Izuku isn't the only one thinking about the battle trials. Do you have a plan? Izuku asks, turning his head just enough to see Bakugo's side profile. Fight him and win, Bakugo replies with a low growl. Well, that's about what Izuku had been expecting, but it still makes him snort a laugh. That's not a plan, Bakugo. The blonde stiffens beside him and turns to glare at him as the bus starts moving. Since they were called last, Izuku has a feeling that they'll be the last ones off the bus, so they have more time to work out how they're going to take All Might down, but first, he has to get Bakugo on the same page as him. Huh? You don't think we can take him? What the fuck are you on about? Bakugo snarls, leaning in closer. I've seen you fight. You've seen me fight. We can fucking beat him. Izuku holds up his hands in a peaceful gesture. No, I know that. We can beat him, he assures, trying to soothe away Bakugo's anger before they end up in an argument they can't reason through. But do you really think that we're being tested on if we can win or not? He moves his gaze past Bakugo's shoulder, watching the grounds of UA move out the window. Come on, think about it. Aizawa listed off 2 win conditions, but he didn't say that our only lose condition was to be put out of commission. This isn't an exam on our ability as fighters. That would be unfair to almost the whole class. You, me, Shoto, Kirishima, and Hitoshi are probably the only ones who are good at fighting right now. So there has to be something else, right? Bakugo's eyes narrow, but he doesn't seem like he's going to blow Izuku off. You clearly have something figured out already, so fucking spit it out. Swallowing a sigh, and his still churning nerves, Izuku leans in closer and lowers his voice. We're being graded on teamwork. They wouldn't have split the class like this otherwise, which means we need to have a plan and execute it, and if it comes down to it, communicate while in the field and adapt as we need to. Which is not really something any of their class have experience in, especially not Izuku. He has always worked alone, has always accomplished his tasks alone. When he and Hitoshi were kidnapped, Izuku let Amahaki out and took care of everything himself. At the USJ, Izuku purposefully partnered Bakugo and Kirishima together while he himself took care of the other half of the villains. And that's not even mentioning the way he strolled into the plaza, blinded by anger and fear for his dad, and took care of the Nomu when he was already so dangerously close to his limit. Hell, even in Hosu, while facing down Stain, the concept of working together with Jedha never even crossed his mind. If it had, the night likely would have ended with fewer injuries. Part of Izuku's self-enforced solitude comes from the fear of hurting others. When he's fighting against villains, he doesn't need to be 100% accurate with the placement or size of the black holes. He just needs to be strong. That whole equation changes as soon as an ally is thrown into the mix. Allies move around, and they use their own quirks, and if Izuku misses his placement by even a few centimeters, or doesn't dispel it fast enough, it could result in disaster. So he closes himself off, keeps a cap on his power, and only fights with his fists when he's with other people. That isn't going to cut it here, though. He needs to use Amahaki if they want to win this, even if they were running, which they won't be because Bakugo isn't the only one with something to prove. As much as Izuku respects All Might as a hero, he still wants to pay him back for his damn ear. Izuku would need to use Amahaki to pin All Might down and give them the clearance to escape. So, Bakugo says, mouth twisting in displeasure. Another lose condition is us not having a fucking plan. He clicks his tongue. Isn't it enough for our goddamn teachers to just have us working together? I mean, for fuck's sake. Izuku gives him a moment to think about it, to stew in his anger before the rational side of Bakugo's brain finally comes around to the idea of being a team. Fine. What's your plan then, nerd? Izuku's face splits into a grin, and he leans closer and lowers his voice as he details to Bakugo exactly what he thinks they should do. The concrete walls of Ground Zeta rise up around Izuku, so tall that they seem to loom over him, like spectators eager to watch him fail. Not that he thinks he's going to. Bakugo did at least listen to his plan, and even agreed to it after making a few adjustments, but he wouldn't put it past the number one hero to hold a grudge for what happened early in the year. Maybe that's not fair. Izuku's only met the man 3 times. He doesn't count their brief glances in the store while there was a gun pressed to Izuku's throat, and he was never outright rude. Actually, he wasn't rude at all. All Might doesn't strike Izuku as someone who is malicious or mean, just incompetent in anything that isn't being a hero, being the symbol of peace. The chances of him holding a grudge against a teenager whose injury during a lesson resulted in him getting removed from teaching said teenager's class are extremely low. Even still, Izuku isn't about to risk being caught off guard by a very real threat. The teachers are allowed to fight them, encouraged to fight them, and All Might is the number one hero. He and Bakugo have a plan, but they're 16 years old, and barely over 3 months into their first year of hero school. Handicap or not, All Might isn't going to be an easy opponent. Luckily for them, both Bakugo and Izuku are smart, strong and powerful. The cement doors close with a muffled boom, and a buzzer sings through the air as their signal to begin. Immediately, a shock wave of pressurized air forces Izuku to take a step back, bracing his body forward against the blast. What the fuck was that? Bakugo is right next to him, sparks igniting along his palms. Izuku laughs, mirthless and bitter. Our handicapped opponent, I guess. Let's go. He holds his fist out, and Bakugo taps it with his own before taking off into the fake city as quickly as his explosions can propel him. For months, Izuku had watched all of his classmates work with their quirks. He has notebooks filled with pages and pages dedicated to all 19 members of Class 1A, and some of 1B too. He knows their quirks just as well, or better, as they do. Which means that when Izuku had told Bakugo to race after All Might as if they didn't have a plan, he had known it would only take a few seconds for Bakugo to reach their opponent and provide a sufficient distraction. Unfortunately, those few seconds drag on like entire minutes. In the time that Izuku's alone, he simply stands near the door, turning his head to take in his surroundings. He doesn't panic, and he makes sure not to look panicked either. Because the only person they're trying to trick right now is All Might. Whoever is watching this exam to grade it, the exam is being proctored, right? Needs to know from the start there's a plan in place so they can't get docked for not trying. As predicted, several seconds after his departure, Bakugo's scream of "Die!" and several explosions come echoing back to Izuku, reverberating through the mock office buildings that litter the area and bouncing off the cement walls of Ground Zeta. Showtime. Izuku takes off running, following the sounds of Bakugo's quirk and All Might's voice and pressurized punches. There's no rubble yet to skirt around, so he sticks to the sidewalk in the shadows of the buildings, winding his way through the alleys where he can and down main roads when he can't. It's eerie to be running through a place that looks so much like a city but that lacks the life that would make it real. It's just cement, and glass and non-functioning streetlights. As the sounds of the fight get louder, Izuku steps slow from a sprint to a jog and finally to a walk. He needs to get there, but he needs to give Bakugo time enough that All Might will be convinced when he acts like he's out of stamina. And sure, maybe a lot of the plan is riding on Bakugo's acting abilities, but Izuku also kind of doubts that All Might will allow Bakugo to lead him on for too long. With or without Bakugo's acting, their fight isn't going to last forever. Sure enough, when he thinks he's about a street away from the fight, the explosions stop and are replaced by a string of curses from Bakugo and All Might's booming laugh. Really, young Bakugo, I must say I'm disappointed, All Might says, though he sounds just happy in his very All Might way. I thought for sure by now you would have learned how to fight with a team instead of going off on your own. Izuku creeps forward, years of training with Aizawa and days spent under Jetta's guidance, ensuring that his footsteps are silent. He pulls off his right glove as he goes, tucking it into one of his belt pouches, and makes a fist to cut off Amahaki's power without draining his mental stamina. And young Aizawa too, All Might booms, still planning on his own. Neither of you have changed since the beginning of the year, and I was hoping that fighting me would give you the chance to put your lone wolf tendencies behind you. You think too highly of yourself, Izuku thinks as he peers around a corner. All Might is standing in the middle of the street with a squirming, growling Bakugo clutched in his hand. Makes Bakugo look small, like a kitten held out by the scruff of his neck. In any other circumstance, the sight would be funny. Let's go see if we can find your partner, shall we? All Might asks. Fuck you, Bakugo spits, looking like he's half ready to bite All Might's hand, if it means getting free. The moment All Might jumps into the air and begins to search for Izuku is the moment Izuku puts the rest of their plan into action. If they had charged in together, All Might would have used them against each other. If they made themselves look like a united front, All Might could have done any number of things in an effort to make their plans fall apart. Fake hostage situations come to mind quickly, especially given All Might's knowledge of Izuku's martyr complex in such an event. So, they have to start separately. Had to make All Might think that his greatest challenge would be getting them to work together, not knowing that they already are. Izuku opens his fist and flicks his fingers, dropping a large black hole beneath All Might for just a fraction of a second. Just enough to catch the number one hero in its gravitational field, but not enough to hurt him. Still, the halting and reversing of his momentum is enough to slam him into the ground, leaving a crater and forcing him to release Bakugo. Immediately, Bakugo shoots away, palms burning with explosions that he aims at All Might before spinning off into the air and landing several meters away on the street. Izuku doesn't catch his gaze and doesn't need to. They're in the game, and they're ready to play. Running away isn't going to work for either of them. They need to win. Taking the distraction of the dust and smoke cloud in stride, Izuku ducks behind the building, starts running for a new vantage point. For the next few minutes, the game of cat and mouse continues. Izuku runs, All Might tries to seek him out, and Bakugo distracts him with vicious attacks as he attempts to slam the handcuffs onto All Might, only for Izuku to reappear and drop a black hole close enough around All Might that the force of the gravity throws him backward, and into a building or a new crater in the ground, like chipping away at a block of marble that slowly start to wear All Might down. And then the game changes. You have a wonderful strategy so far, young heroes, All Might booms, hands and fists on his hips. But it's not enough to bring me down, I think. It's time you stop hiding, young Aizawa, and face me with your partner. Before Izuku can do much as brace himself, All Might winds back his fist and slams it into the ground. A shock wave pulses outward, distorting the street, shattering windows and inevitably toppling the nearby buildings. Izuku's thrown backward into a building, and all the air leaving his lungs as his head cracks painfully against concrete before he has enough sense to place a black hole nearby to keep him from flying away and to prevent most of the rubble from the building in front of him from pelting his body. His vision swims, the world around him tilting and spotted with black dots for a moment. He's honestly not sure if the black dots are real pieces of Amahaki or from obvious concussion that he now has. But eventually he decides it doesn't matter. He can't get rid of them no matter how hard he blinks, so he's just going to have to live with them for now. As soon as the pressure threatening to sweep him away disappears, Izuku drops the black hole and slumps to his knees. His body aches. His right hand is freezing. Overhead the looming walls leer at him, and the sun shines down hot and uncaring. He can hear, faintly to his left, the popping explosions that signal Bakugo's quirk, and he forces his eyes in that direction to make sure Bakugo is okay. He is, thankfully. There's no blood visible from this distance, and he's hovering in the air again, farther from All Might than before, but steady. Ah, there you are, Shonen, All Might calls, and when Izuku looks at him, he finds his face split into his signature smile. Welcome to the fight. Izuku bares his teeth and forces himself to his feet. He hurts, and his fingers twitch with the effort of not immediately lashing out with Amahaki. Under his skin, the god is restless and angry, bubbling up near the surface of his palms and coiling tight around his spine and his throat and his sternum. Izuku breathes in, and Amahaki seems to breathe with him, expanding and contracting around his lungs as both a comfort and a promise of retribution. Bakugo, Izuku says, raising his voice just enough to hopefully be heard. The fuck do you want, nerd? He's practically screaming as he moves closer, and Izuku's grateful because it means he can actually make out what Bakugo is saying. You ready to give up after just one hit? Gonna let me take all the damn glory? Are you okay? Can you continue? Izuku's found after a few months of being friends with Bakugo that it's relatively easy to read between the lines of what he says. Trying once more to blink the black spots out of his eyes, Izuku turns his gaze back to All Might, who seems to be giving them a moment to regroup, which is kind of him, and a good sign that maybe he is learning how to be a teacher, albeit slowly. Do you remember the lesson Yamada-sensei gave us at the end of May, right after we came back from our internships? There had been 2 lessons that day, technically, but only one of them can apply to their current situation, and he hopes that Bakugo's on the same page. Bakugo drops to the ground a few meters away from Izuku and scoffs. Of course I remember. The fuck kind of idiot do you take me for? That's exactly the response Izuku was hoping for, and he can't stop a devilish grin, Aizawa's grin, from curling across his face. Good. He lowers his voice to a volume just for them. I can hook it, I think, if I can get close enough for him not to notice where I place it. You'll need to move fast, though, he says, concern lacing his tone for just a moment. As fast as you can possibly go. The click of Bakugo's tongue against his teeth is oddly reassuring. Don't you dare start thinking you're strong enough to hurt me, motherfucker. Izuku laughs despite the sharp pain it brings to his temples. Wouldn't dream of it. He's glad, in this moment, that Bakugo's his partner. He's glad that, since he has to face down All Might, the person by his side is able to keep up with him in smarts and power. Well, okay, technically, not in power. But even All Might couldn't match Izuku pound for pound if he were to really let go, because it's not a quirk, it's a god. And the only thing that's keeping that god restrained right now is the willpower and tightly clenched fist of a traumatized and currently kind of angry 16-year-old. If this fight was just Izuku against All Might, it would be over already, but it's not. And Izuku can honestly say that he's tired of getting by only on the strength of Amahaki's veritable wellspring of power. He's tired of facing every problem, down with the conclusion that the most viable solution is to use the unrestrained destructive power of a fucking black hole. If he hadn't started to think like this, maybe he would have reacted faster against Stain. Maybe Jedha wouldn't have been injured. All Might suddenly rushes forward, and Izuku throws his hand out to stop him with a new black hole. It's the same moment Bakugo takes off. Dropping the handcuffs for Izuku to catch, he tucks him safely into a pouch on his belt, and then he's facing All Might again. For a few seconds, they repeat the same song and dance. All Might gets to his feet. Izuku throws a black hole, wash, rinse, start over, and then Izuku takes off his left glove. Amahaki swells within him, ready to break him down and reform him into something bigger, stronger, angrier, formidable, but Izuku shoves a cap on it and rushes forward. He hasn't done this in a while, not since the battle trials against Bakugo, actually, and even that was just an accident, but he's eager for a second attempt. At a full sprint, Izuku runs toward All Might, eyes open and tracking each of All Might's movements. He jumps around rubble, vaults over fallen streetlights, and loosens his fists. All Might reaches for him, likely in an attempt at grabbing Izuku the way he had grabbed Bakugo previously, and Izuku runs straight toward his hand, then drops into a slide at the last moment. With bitterly cold black, flames, smoke oil, matter dancing around his fists, Izuku punches All Might's knee as he slips underneath him on his hip. All Might stumbles from the force of the blow, though he manages to catch himself before he drops to his knee. Izuku's on his feet before he fully stops sliding, bracing with his toes and gaining leverage with a palm to the ground. Tiny bits of rubble scrape his hand, but he ignores it in favor of grinning at All Might. What? He asks, feigning cockiness as he straightens his posture and shakes his sweaty bangs out of his eyes. Did you think I could only fight at range? The number 1 hero laughs, and the sound echoes through the empty space around them. Well done, young Aizawa. Although really all you've done is trade places with young Bakugo, I have to say I'm disappointed in your lack of teamwork and strategy. With this, All Might runs forward again, hand open the same way as before to capture, not strike. Izuku dodges, throwing out a black hole in close range and using his left hand to block All Might's reaching fingertips. He dances backward a few steps as All Might finds his balance again, careful about the chunks of rubble between him and his destination. But his eyes don't leave his opponent, not once glancing away. He knows just how fast All Might is, even taking those weights into consideration. After all, Izuku has pages upon pages of analysis dedicated to the number 1 hero, and if he can't put it to use here, to win, then what the fuck good is it? They trade blows for a while, All Might finally giving up on capture and instead trying to get Izuku out of the equation a far easier way, by punching him back. It almost fucking works, too, when Izuku doesn't get a block up fast enough and he's thrown backwards by a punch that would have left his skull cracked open if it had been at full strength. As it is, Izuku sees stars, and his ribs creak, and more of Amahaki slips out of him. Both of his arms are wound tight with jagged marks under his tall armbands, visible only in the open seam between his biceps and shoulders. They're an angry red and black, and smoke or dark matter of whatever Amahaki's form is made of seeps out of the cracks in his loose fists. The stress on his bones is enormous where Amahaki twists around them, but Izuku can only grit his teeth and keep leading All Might away from the crater he blew into the street. Finally, Izuku stumbles over a stack of rubble and enters the first ring of houses. All Might isn't looking around him. He's a pro, though, so he's probably noticed. But Izuku's going to take the win, even if it means All Might is holding back because this is a fucking final exam for first years, so of course, All Might is holding back, which means that Izuku can keep guiding him to where he needs to be. When All Might lunges this time, Izuku stays in close, punching up with his right hand and swinging his right leg out to hook at All Might's ankle. His left arm comes up to block a punch, deflecting it into a glancing blow instead of something that would break his bones, and then quickly starts fumbling with his belt pouches. He has to stay inside of All Might's max reach, has to duck and parry and give his own punches because if he doesn't, then this won't work. It's hard, and it hurts, but he's so high on adrenaline right now that he can't really tell. Before All Might can get tired of the repetition of the fight, Izuku glances away from him for the first time since this all started. He sees what he needs to see, even as he acknowledges All Might's hand coming toward him again. Bakugo! As hard as he can, Izuku throws the handcuffs with his left hand. The moment they leave his grasp, All Might's palm slams into his chest and pins him to the wall behind him. Every last gasp of air leaves Izuku's lungs, but he's not done yet. He watches the arc of the handcuffs, through the air, the way All Might reaches out with his hand, the bright flashes of explosions off of Bakugo's palms as he races in. Izuku watches, and he calculates, and he drops a black hole in the middle of it all. Math used to be his worst subject, back when Aizawa was teaching him in the backwards way that only worked for them, back when Izuku had to parse through information in his own way and try to make sense of it. Photographic memory aside, Izuku is always striving to understand, even if he simply knows everything he reads. But then middle school happened, and Izuku was taught first and assigned homework after. Suddenly numbers and equations made sense. Made even more sense when he was watching math happen in real time, in the middle of a battle. Bakugo's incredible speed, the length of All Might's reach, the weight and velocity of the handcuffs, and somewhere in the center, a precisely placed and specifically sized black hole, invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for it. Bakugo is looking. The handcuffs whip into the gravitational field of the black hole, and Izuku drops it, watching the momentum of the handcuffs speed up and change direction, watching Bakugo increase the force of the explosions in his left hand to pivot and catch them midair. He spins under All Might's arm, slaps the cuff on his wrist, and barrels into Izuku, the force of his impact roughly breaking All Might's hold on his chest. They end up falling to the ground and rolling away, but Izuku feels Bakugo's hand against the back of his head, his other arm firmly holding him close until their momentum stops and they can finally, slowly get to their feet. Izuku is dizzy, and the concussion isn't helping. He leans his weight against Bakugo's side as he blinks up at All Might, who is just standing there, smiling widely at them, the handcuffs dangling from one wrist. A crackle fills the air, following by a recording of Nezu's voice. Bakugo and Aizawa pass. Fuck, Izuku swears, and his legs finally give out. He slips to the ground, sitting with his head between his knees to fight off a sudden but insistent wave of nausea. Recovery Girl is going to be pissed about this concussion. He can hear her grumbling lecture already. Bakugo, can you... My gloves. He has to swallow thickly in the middle of the sentence and just gives up on filling in the missed words. His intention comes across anyway, because Bakugo's suddenly kneeling next to him, hands working at the pouches on his belt. Just call me Katsuki, fucking nerd, he grumbles as he slides on Izuku's left glove first and then his right. There's a huge scrape running down Bakugo's left arm, tracking fresh blood through old blood and caked on dirt. His face is bruised, his lip is split, and he's panting for breath, but he's smiling something feral and victorious. You've earned it. Izuku blinks up at him, unsure if the fogginess in his vision is the concussion or fresh tears. He smiles, regardless, and it's so wide it hurts his cheeks. Katsuki, then. We won. Katsuki scoffs, but when he helps Izuku back to his feet, his grip is firm and unyielding, arguably gentle as he supports Izuku's swaying body. Of course we did. As if there was any doubt. And he's right. There was never any doubt. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 42 of Swallow the Stars. Chapter 43 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.